Morning and welcome to our fourth week for Earth's changing climate. So last week we talked about hydrology, we talked about water in the Earth system and all of the sort of various components of that. This week we are moving on and covering the biosphere portion of the material, and we're going to cover the biosphere with a kind of a focus on our understanding of extinctions. I think this will help us to kind of frame and conceptualize the role the biosphere plays in the Earth system and the ways in which we are changing it profoundly. Oops. So first I need to just make sure that I am floating on top. All right. So before we get into that, we're going to need to define life. So what is life? How do we conceptualize and think of and define life? There's four ways in which something that exists can be defined as life. First of all, right. So these are processes and characteristics that are essential to all living things. So first of all, life must metabolize. So metabolism is basically the sum of all the chemical reactions which are used to live, right? In humans, metabolism is we eat something, our body digests it, we turn some of that into energy, which we then use to grow and move around the world and do other things, and then we get rid of the waste. Ways in which plants, for example, metabolize is that they use a process known as photosynthesis, where they take carbon dioxide and nutrients from the soil and sunlight and water, and they combine those to do the same things, right, that sort of are required of all living things, which is live and grow and reproduce, which are the remaining characteristics and essentials essential characteristics of things that are alive. So metabolism. The second one is growth. All things grow. This is the ordering and organizing of atoms and molecules to make larger molecules. Some things are single-celled, so they don't grow that much, but they still grow. They still do some ordering and organizing. And then for like humans, for example, we grow a lot. And this growth requires a source of energy which comes from our metabolisms. So we have metabolism, we have growth, we have reproduction. All organisms must reproduce, whether it's through asexual cell division or sexual means, we must reproduce. And then finally, all things evolve. Evolution is, of course, defined as the process by which genetic changes occur in populations of organisms over time, which allow for the survival of that living thing. If things stop evolving, they eventually will stop living as both an individual organism and as a species. And if the whole species stops evolving or evolution doesn't keep up fast enough, then the species is said to have gone extinct, which is something that we're going to talk about in depth today. So we typically organize life via a classification system, which was first written about and set forward by Carl Linnaeus, who we're going to talk about later on in this lecture. So at the very basic level, we have cells. Some life is just a single cell. But some life is multiple cells. Either way, both single-celled and multiple-celled forms of life are known as organisms. They're individual organisms. I'm an organism. This plant is an organism. And a single bacteria is an organism, etc., etc., etc. If you have a group of organisms, then you have a population. Okay, so for example, Chicago has a population of human organisms. It also has a population of coyotes and a population of squirrels. You could even go lower in scale, smaller in scale, and say The neighborhood of Pilsen, for example, has a population of squirrels or a population of humans. When you take all of those populations and you consider them all together, populations that are all the same, right? For example, all the humans, that's a species. So we have species which can be really geographically isolated. For example, there are individual species on each of the Galapagos Islands, or you can have species that are spread across the entire world, like humans, clovers, dandelions, bumblebees, houseflies. These types of species are distributed very widely in relation to very sort of microspecific species, but nonetheless, they are species which are all of the same type of organisms. And then if we go higher up in the classification, you can have communities, and then you can have ecosystems where you have multiple species which are interacting with their environment. So we have ecosystems like tropical rainforest ecosystems. We have like the Brazilian Amazon rainforest ecosystem, or we have the northern Great Plains prairie grass ecosystem, or the eastern United States woodland forest ecosystem, etc., etc., etc. And then we can consider even one level higher, which is a biome, which is ecosystems that are all kind of the same. So for example, we can have the tropical rainforest biome, or we can have the savanna grassland biome, which can include both the savannas in Africa and perhaps the grasslands in North America. So those are single biomes. But again, the classification is individual, and there's no right or wrong way to necessarily do ecosystems and biomes, although many organizations and people have over the years attempted to standardize these types of things. Species, however, have been standardized, and we'll talk about that. Okay, so if we're thinking about all of the species on Earth, of which there are multitudes, we typically classify them into 6 different types, which we call kingdoms. So of course we have animals and plants and fungi, which are like mushrooms and mold. But then on a more smaller scale, individual scale, right? So single cell or very few cells, we have protists, which the most iconic protist is like an amoeba. We have bacteria, right? And then we have archaea bacteria, which are similar in form and function to bacteria, but have been classified as a different kingdom because of their history and because of their distribution and because of their sort of functionality within ecosystems. So normally in class, I would have you break out into groups, and each group would take one of these kingdoms and do sort of a little exercise on that. But I'm going to skip that today in lieu of what I think is a more exciting group exercise. So let's talk first then about the history of life on Earth, and then we'll revisit some of the other sort of more granular aspects of life, and this will lead us into a discussion of mass extinctions. So when Earth first formed 4.55 billion years ago or so, that period of Earth's history for the first, 750 million years or so was known as the Hadean Eon. And as far as we know, no life lived on the Earth. The Earth was hot and tumultuous rock with many fissures, volcanoes, cracks where magma and hot lava would come pouring out. There wasn't really an atmosphere as we conceive of it today. The sun was a different both size and temperature and intensity. It was a very hostile environment if we're thinking about life being able to survive it. It's not something that we would generally consider to be hospitable to life. And so that persisted from the beginning of Earth's history until about 3.85 million years ago. GYRS stands for, billion years ago. I don't know why they use a G. So during that time, during about 3.85 billion years ago, we transitioned from what's known as the Hadean Eon to the Archean Eon. And the Archean Eon was characterized by a slightly less hostile Earth, the result of millions and millions of years of volcanic eruptions created bodies of water, which we might think of as sort of proto-oceans, the nascent beginnings of oceans, and in contrast to that, land masses or continents. It was still a fairly inhospitable place for what we would consider modern life. The atmosphere was very different than it is now, but it is around this time that we know that life first appeared on the Earth, around 4 billion years ago or so. It's possible that there was life even earlier than this, but there's a lot more to that I'm not going to cover necessarily in this class, but is worth looking at if that's something that's really interesting to you. The earliest organisms were probably simpler than bacteria. They were probably very similar to the archaea bacteria that exist on the Earth today. And in order for this original life form to exist, to have been, to come into existence, three things needed to happen in order for this particular organism to develop. The first is chemosynthesis. So chemosynthesis is the synthesis of small organic molecules, which we now call amino acids, coming together, right, to form an amino acid, which is essentially a protein strip. Okay, once you have that chemosynthesis, once you create that amino acid protein strip, then you need biosynthesis, which is the combination of these smaller amino acids into longer molecules, which we then would actually call full proteins instead of just strips of amino acids. So you put all these amino acids together, you get a protein. And then if you have enough proteins that come together, then you get the development of chemical process needed for metabolism and replication, which is essentially the formation of the first DNA and RNA. Okay, so first you have chemosynthesis, which creates amino acids. Then you have biosynthesis, which creates proteins from amino acids. And then you have the creation of DNA from those proteins. Okay, these three things needed to happen in order for there to be the first life on Earth. We don't know when or how or where life first originated. One of the theories that's been proposed is that the oceans and the bodies of water across the Earth were a primordial soup of products of chemosynthesis, little amino acids and clumps of protein strips and sort of these sorts of things floating around in the surface, which was kind of warmer due to volcanic and solar heat and the reactions on the surfaces of different types of rocks. Kind of like this sort of chemistry experiment, this like sort of mad scientist chemistry experiment. We now think that that's probably not how life actually originated. We actually think life originated at the bottom of the ocean on these black smokers or these deep sea hydrothermal vents. Okay, so there are cracks in the Earth's surface where the heat from the inside of the Earth, from the core of the Earth, escapes just a little bit. And one of the most famous of these, of course, is like Old Faithful Geyser in Yellowstone National Park. But at the bottom of the ocean, we do have these black smokers, these deep sea hydrothermal vents, on the surfaces of which minerals and these amino acids and these other sort of like proto-proteins could concentrate together in clumps on this warm, nutrient-rich surface, which is promoting chemosynthesis and biosynthesis and these more complex reactions, which could then occur and produce these DNA single-celled sort of archaea bacteria molecules on these deep sea hydrothermal black smokers. So that's probably what we now know happened. So we have the Hadean Eon, inhospitable Earth, and then about 4 billion years ago or so, we switch into the Archean Eon during this Precambrian period of Earth's history. And for billions and billions of years, life on Earth is characterized by just simple, single-celled, bacteria-type life forms, organisms. for many, 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 many years. In fact, if we think of the history of life on Earth as sort of a clock, if you will, then, let's use like a traditional clock analogy. If this is midnight and then we have 3 a.m., let's do it like a full day. So midnight, 6 a.m., noon, and then 6 p.m., and then midnight again, right? It takes all the way until maybe, if this is like the beginning of the solar system. The origin of Earth is about 1 or 2 a.m., and then it takes all the way until about 6 a.m., right, for there to be the first life forms on Earth. Okay, these very simple single-celled archaea bacteria. And then for half the day, really, from 6 a.m., if we're thinking of all of the history of the solar system as one single day, right? The Earth forms at like 1:30 a.m. Life forms at, the Earth forms at like 2 a.m., we'll say. Life forms at like just before 6 a.m. And then for many, many billions of years, life exists on Earth as a single-celled, low diversity of species organisms. Okay, it's not until halfway through this little clock that you even get oxygen-generating photosynthesis, what we would think of as plant things that mimic plants. We're still single cells, though, right? We don't have multiple cells. It takes all the way to here, right? 2/3 of the way through this day before you even get multiple cell organisms, which we call eukaryotes, okay? Eukaryotes are organisms that actually have a nucleus instead of the DNA just floating around in the cell. So it takes all the way to here to even get a nucleus, right? And then it takes all the way half the day, almost, a little more than half of the time in which life existed on Earth was spent as a single-celled organisms only. Species were only single cells. It took half of that time for there to even be multicellular organisms. And then it takes all the way almost until the end of the day before you even get plants on land, right? So all of this is happening in the ocean first. You have some diversification of animals, and then you finally get plants on land, and then things really boom and take off. And this event right here, noted by this line, is very important in Earth's history, and I'm going to get to that in a second. So then you have land plants, and you have like the diversification of animals, and then finally in this sort of 11th, the 59th minute of the 11th hour, you get humans. So we're very young in terms of sort of thinking of the history of all life on Earth. Humans have existed for a very, 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 very small sliver of that time. So I mentioned that something crazy happened around 570 million years ago, right? Noted by this line here, followed by land plants, for example. So you have the diversification of animals and land plants happening all around this time. And I froze again.